This is Josh Beiser from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this critical thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright everybody, before we get started with today's critical thought, we are finally almost done with Bloodborne. So as a quick update, tomorrow will be more Nihon play, and then Saturday will essentially be the last day of Bloodborne coverage here on the channel. I'll be basically uploading all my little spotlights I took from the Old Hunters DLC and final boss fight. So don't be surprised if you get like 5 or 6 updates from me on Saturday, and then we're finally done, and we can move on to some more games, including of course the Bastion run. But anyway, let's get today's critical thought. And this is going to be talking about the idea behind balancing overpowered mechanics. This has to do with a post I talked about, seems like a few years ago, when I brought the idea behind panic button or trump card-esque mechanics or options for a player to use in video games. And what I mean about these overpowered mechanics are essentially options that the player has that are just completely dominating. These are just like the perfect solution to any situation. If this was a multiplayer game, these options would be nerfed to hell. And when we look at these kinds of panic button situations or overpowered mechanics, they typically come from the action genre. Most famously, one of the big examples would be Devil May Cry's Devil Trigger. When this mechanic was introduced in the game, it basically gave the player enhanced damage and gave them life recovery while they were attacking enemies. We've seen similarities of this in so many different action titles, from God of War, Dante's Inferno, recently with Nihon with the living weapon concept, and probably more than I'm forgetting right now. And another big example that I talked about when I made my posts would be from Alan Wake, which it may be hard to see in that screenshot, but in Alan Wake, light is considered a weapon, not to be confused with the game Revolution X, where music was the weapon, or just throwing CDs at people's heads. And in Alan Wake, the two best items in the game in terms of dealing with large groups of enemies were flares and the actual flare gun. And while it may be hard to make out, in this scene, Alan is using a flare. And how it works in the game is, if you're about to be attacked and you're surrounded and there's no way for you to get out, you can pop a flare and it will basically scare all the enemies away from the player for, I think it's like 5-10 seconds. And this becomes essentially a panic button kind of mechanic for the game, by the fact that because Alan can't really fight multiple enemies effectively, and a lot of the game is about running from safe zone to safe zone, the flares basically give you a reprieve from the combat. Now, an item like this in any other game that essentially wards off all enemies without fail would be considered overpowered, and basically is the part of this discussion. Now, when we talk about game balance, you would think that an overpowered mechanic like the flares, Nihon's living weapon, Devil Trigger, etc. would be something that you need to tone down. But when it's handled just right, these kinds of panic button type options can do a lot to give the player an emergency get out of trouble free card, or as a means of tipping the scales in their favor. And for those of you watching this, can you think of a catchier title than Panic Button or Overpowered Mechanics? Because I can't think of any, and it's driving me nuts because it sounds too wordy. But when it comes to these kinds of mechanics, what we see developers typically do is try to limit their use in some way. Usually mechanics of this kind, you're not going to be able to use it every second of your game, and it's not going to last for like 10-15 minutes, stuff like that. Now, the important part of this is when it comes to these kinds of overpowered mechanics, you can't make them too limited. On an earlier critical thought, we talked about the issues of item hoarding. And when an item is so good that the player will never want to use it because they're saving it for the perfect situation. And again, if you have an item that gives you 6,000% more damage, but only for one attack, you're not going to use that on a common enemy, even if you are one hit away from dying. You're going to want to save that for when, who knows, the final boss, the optional secret boss, whatever. But when it comes to balancing these kinds of overpowered mechanics, what we see developers typically do is have basically a built-in limiter based on the player's performance. In Devil May Cry, and I think even in Bayonetta, I think which with her, I want to say the witch time, but I think it may have been another mechanic. What they did was, as the player performed better in the game, pulling off combos, dealing damage, this would build the meter up. And in this way, it basically rewards the player for being good, with essentially a few seconds of being just a complete badass. And in Devil May Cry, this became very powerful during the Dante versus Virgil fights, where the battles almost became like a sense of flow to them, as both the player and Virgil would make use of their respective devil triggers. And you had a balance between, do I use my trigger to counter his, or do I wait for his to finish, and then do I go into devil mode to then try and overtake him? With games like Alan Wake and other titles that feature overpowered mechanics built around like inventory or limited use items, what they did with the game is you can only hold so many flares at a time. And the flares, while they will be replenished as you explore, you're never going to be in a situation where you're basically swimming in flares and the flare gun ammo, which I think that weapon was even rarer than the flails. Flails. Wow, can't talk anymore. The flare, wow, my mouth just completely died on me, so let's move on before it goes any further. But you get the point. With these kinds of overpowered mechanics, part of the challenge as the game developer is figuring out just how much you want to give the player this kind of out. If the player can use it in any battle, no matter what's going on, then it can trivialize the game and make things too easy. But if it becomes so much of a strain to recover or get what you need to use it again, then we run right back into the item hoarding situation. One of the things that I like about a game like Nioh is that the living weapon really can only be used against certain enemies, because you have to get the special resource Amrita to recover it. But for the most part, it's not something that will generally, I guess, make things too easy for you. It makes you invulnerable, yes, but it's not something that can be used willy-nilly and stuff like along those lines. And speaking of Nioh, that reminds me of Ninja Gaiden and Ninja Gaiden Black. One of the things you could use was his special ninja arts to give you a few seconds of invulnerability. And my favorite was the lightning, which basically gave you like 10 seconds where nothing can hurt you. And I made use of that heavily when I was doing very hard mode, basically to give myself a reprieve and to deal with all the enemies around me. Now, while this was a perfect item for just about any dangerous situation, I was limited. I could only, I think, carry like 3 or 4 scrolls at a time, or something along those lines. And again, while this was considered overpowered, it was kept in balance. And speaking of which, as a kind of a preview for the next critical thought or an upcoming one, a really good example of these kinds of overpowered mechanics and how they can be integrated into the game design, interestingly, is from Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter. This game has one of the best uses of an overpowered mechanic that I've seen, and unfortunately, if we start talking about that now, we'll be here for another 20-30 minutes. But stay tuned in the coming days for that critical thought. But speaking about that, when it comes to these overpowered mechanics, the better integrated they are into design usually will help things out. And one of the more interesting cases would be something like the Power Star from Super Mario and all the platformers. While in the old days, the Power Star was simply as a means of providing a few seconds of vulnerability, craftier level designers, especially those who have been making use of Mario Maker, have integrated the Power Star by using it as essentially a timed race through a hazardous section, We've seen this with, having tons of spikies or those like piranha plants you can run on top of and stuff along those lines. And again, it's an interesting way because normally you wouldn't be able to make use of this. But the Power Star, even though it grants you invulnerability and would be considered overpower, has those limitations. And the fact that the limitations become an essential part of the level design makes it all the more fascinating. But let's wrap things up, I guess, for today. To summarize, when it comes to overpower mechanics, by themselves, they aren't going to doom or destroy your game's balance. And in many cases, they can provide interesting twists on your design. When you look at games like League of Legends, Overwatch, or other team-based type designs, many of them feature heroes with a ultra power, which is usually a few seconds of a special buff or a one-time, massive attack kind of deal. And these kinds of abilities are game changers. And when players play their cards right, these can win or lose matches in any kind of Dota or multiplayer based game. And again, if the player could make use of this every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds, stuff like that, it would break the game's balance. And part of your job as a game developer is understanding how to fine tune things. There always has to be a limit, but it should still be possible or plausible to get back or get that use back. As we've said with stuff like Alan Wake or games that feature like an inventory based one, you shouldn't deny the player this item. Like, it shouldn't be something that only shows up 5 times in your entire game kind of deal. And speaking of which, when it comes to this kind of overpowered design, one of the things you want to watch out for is when it comes to limiting it via like an inventory based system, is if the player can only use it sparingly, then you want to balance that with the game's design. What that means is, if this item is so powerful, you don't want to design a section that explicitly requires it. What that means, or as I'm saying, like with the Mario example, that would be a special exception, because the level designers are literally crafting the level around the Power Star. But if we're playing just a regular game through normal progression, then there shouldn't be a section where if I don't have a flare or if I don't have Devil Trigger, I literally can't win. And some examples of that off the top of my head are few and far between. I'm trying to remember if the Suffering 2 suffered, no pun intended, with that kind of problem. It had a overpower mechanic with the main character Torque. I can't believe I remember that. Who could turn into a monster and get increased health regeneration and do massive damage. And the final boss fight required you to use his monster form to do any damage, but then you had enemies who were designed explicitly to knock you out of it. And it just made that fight a massive pain. And like I was saying, when it comes to this kind of balance, these kinds of overpower mechanics are good to have. They are your get out of trouble free cards, but they're not supposed to be game breaking. Again, with like the Devil Trigger example, I can't stay in Devil Trigger for an entire length of a level. I can maybe stay into it for the length of a small fight, or maybe a few seconds of a longer fight. But it's not something that I'm going to rely on 100% of the time. Another good example of this will of course be the pylons from Diablo 3 that were added with the Rift challenges. Those pylons are game breaking. I mean, if you watch my play of Diablo 3 Season Hardcore, a conduit pylon with a speed pylon, and I'm basically invulnerable Mario, just running around, enemies are just melting at the sight of me. That's very awesome, but it's not something that I could play Diablo 3 with all the time. No matter how great that would be, it would just destroy any semblance of balance. And that's the key point when it comes to these kinds of mechanics. While you can make them overpowered, again, you have to figure out a way to balance them with the rest of your game. What will end up happening is either A, they'll be so powerful and so prevalent that the rest of your design's broken, or they're so limited or so weak that the player will never make use of it or will feel like they're kind of being punished for using it. Now, while we touched on examples from team-based games such as Overwatch and League of Legends, I'm sure there's a lot more we can talk about when it comes to multiplayer balance. I guess just to briefly touch on that for the end of this critical thought. When it comes to multiplayer balance, it really comes down to what is the response to this overpowered mechanic. For instance, with Tracer, with her ultimate ability, which puts that sticky bomb on someone, what can someone do to defend against it? Can they defend against it? And is there a direct counter? For instance, when McCree does his high noon, I forget like the fancy title for it, it can't be countered very easily by I think Reinhardt's shield does it, simply killing McCree before he gets the shot off, or hiding behind a corner. In this way, we have an overpowered mechanic, but it has several ways of getting around it. Winston's power up has one. I forget her name. I'll go with Mai because that's easier to remember. Mai's ultra can be countered by simply getting away from it, or being able to react fast enough. Roadhog is close proximity, etc. Again, when it comes to multiplayer balance, you don't want something that is just a metaphorical I win button. I hit the skill, the entire enemy team dies, and we win. That's obviously not good balance. As long as you have a way of limiting it, or a way of countering it, it can be made use of. And again, with Overwatch's example, all the ultimates cannot be just triggered on the fly. They require it to be charged up. But again, let's end things here before we get even longer. Thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you enjoyed things, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have suggestions for topics, games to look at, or digesting design pieces, be sure to let me know below. And be sure to tune in tomorrow night for this week's edition of Game Wisdom Live over on the Twitch stream. Until then, I'm Josh Beiser from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Have a great night, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBeiser for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBeiser for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.